Either form back this video in. Thank you. Okay, calls out to order. I'd welcome our team to the 6th round today. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to participate. Please, sir.
The modern context ASEAN finds itself in is one of adversity and is one of danger. And I personally believe in this motion because in terms of what China is doing in the South China Sea, in terms of what Tony Abbott did to Indonesia, in terms of everything else that's happening in terms of the security of ASEAN, it can no longer stay an economic institution. We think that it's time for it to bank on its political evolution, as it did in Myanmar when it intervened and told them to lay down Aung San Suu Kyi. We think that it is time for it to progress in terms of something new. If at that junction in time it evolved into something political, and in terms of that junction in time there was a political problem, we think that in this junction of time where there's a military problem, we need to apply an action that is just as militarily proficient. So what do we propose? We propose a non-standing army, a peacekeeping force. Its task is not one to invade or to be used for political leverage. It is there to keep the peace along the highways of trade which we recognize are in the South China Sea. With another union or in another country, they would have had landlocked areas. But in the particular case of the ASEAN, we'll probably be using navies, we'll be probably using boats, and we'll probably be using the communal effort of Malaysia and Singapore in a once-in-a-lifetime thing. We don't think that will do again. So, what am I going to be bringing you from Prime Minister? I'll be arguing 5 things, but in these 5 things you're going to receive 2 answers to these questions. Firstly, why is it in ASEAN's interest to do this? And secondly, why would ASEAN be in trouble if it didn't follow through militarily? So, on to the first of 5. Why is it that it is parallel and a logical step from what ASEAN has been doing before? I already explained Burma. Before what happened with Aung San Suu Kyi and human rights violations in Burma, ASEAN was a purely economic institution. That meant that it respected the constitutionality of what ASEAN was founded to be. However, it saw there were dangers to trade, there were dangers to culture, which occurred because of a political human rights problem. They decided as an institution to interfere, even if it meant violating those original goals, because they saw it was interdependent. So, in this context, why do we see the same thing? Because with China's largesse and with China's military expansion in the South China Sea, trade itself would be more dangerous. Case study for this is the Falkland Islands and the United Kingdom government. Because of constant struggle between the mainland and Falkland, there will always be a premium on trade between the island and the civilization. So what are we trying to say? It is in ASEAN's economic interest and cultural interest for it to have a peacekeeping force, lest it have more incursions. And we're not talking about probability. These are facts. Vietnamese fishing boats have been arrested and sent home because China decided that it was unfair for them to be in Chinese territory. Who in the right mind would claim the whole South China Sea, Mr. Speaker? We think that this is ridiculous. Let's second 5 arguments. Why do we think that this is also in the best interest of ASEAN coming to 2015? What do we know is happening next year? The final integration of ASEAN into a bigger supranational entity. What is a supranational entity? It is a communal effort by different states of different ideologies and backgrounds to come together into a full union. That means we might have a currency. That means we might remove all trade barriers between these states. And this means that it's going to be ever more dangerous that other ASEAN countries are volatile while stable ASEAN countries are dependent on them to be safe. This means that Singapore's economy becomes dependent on whether we rid the Philippine Muslims of their crisis in the south. This means, Mr. Speaker, that it is of interest to these nations, because of the new integrations happening in 2015, that we become a little bit more hands-on. I'm going to make a concession. This might mean that a little bit more sovereignty is lost, and this might mean that a little bit more subsidiarity is lost. But in the interest of the economic benefits that all these nations gain because of this, even in terms of culture, like how education standards become a lot higher for the poorest of these countries, the trade-off is something that's worth the cost. I'm going to take a POI. Yes.
So, do you honestly believe that ASEAN, with a tenth of China's military budget, the fifth of its population, is really going to stand up to the Chinese military with a peacekeeping force?
No, but it helps the United States' efforts in making sure that ASEAN is a safe place. This is the third argument, how we don't want to be fully dependent on the United States and we want our own boats. How come? Firstly, the United States owes China $1 trillion. That means it becomes a little less likely for the United States to intervene in case of full-on incursion. What these boats do is allows the might of Singapore and Malaysia to protect poor Philippines and poor Vietnam from Chinese supremacy. And we don't think that it's a very small thing. The Singaporean armed forces are lethal, ladies and gentlemen. The Malaysian armed forces contain some of the best fighters in the region in terms of air superiority combat. And this is surprising, coming that they're a land nation. But what we're trying to say at this point is, we don't want to trust in the United States following through on promises, especially when money's involved. But even if that was out of the scenario, it's a good thing to be militarily independent. This is what the African Union is doing. The European Union might afford not to do this because they have an idea of pacifism and, well, it's a little bit safer in West Europe. But in terms of Asia, where we have the Jemaah Islamiyah, a non-state actor terrorist group in Indonesia and Philippines, and when we have Chinese boats, and when we have pirates as well, Mr. Speaker, it's a good idea that we're not dependent on the United States of America. Fourthly, why do we think that this is good in principle? Because we think that ASEAN member states have claims on islands and waterways in the South China Sea. Vietnam claims an unspecified part. Malaysia claims an area a little bit over 900 nautical miles, and the Philippines claims the Spratly Islands. The difference here is we have civilians, Malaysian citizens, Filipino citizens in these areas fishing or actually even living there. This means that you have a moral responsibility to protect these individuals, but they can't do it themselves. But what this does uniquely for ASEAN is it allows it to stand up for these nations. Sure, we might not decide who actually owns it, but at least we protect these people from China, which claims it away from all of ASEAN. We think that this might even help, because the end goal of this is to bring it up to international arbitration with UNCLOS and the United Nations. But that will become a lot less possible if China doesn't see ASEAN as a formidable actor. And this is the last point. Why do you think that this strikes terror in the hearts of those who would think us small? We can't forget that Tony Abbott wiretapped the presidents of Indonesia's phones as an incursion of sovereignty on their head of state. That's how other bigger entities see ASEAN, because it's toothless and it's purely economic. The raising of a peacekeeping force sends a signal that ASEAN is ready to stand up on its feet when its sovereignty is challenged. But that will forever be absent if it's just for culture and it's just for economics. For those 5 reasons, I haven't been more confident to propose.
Prime Minister for his speech, and I'd like to invite the leader of the session to open the case offside, please.
Hear, hear.
I think that we should open this debate by defining what exactly a peacekeeping organization is. A peacekeeping organization is a group that is either invited into a country by its government or authorized to intervene in a country by the United Nations Security Council for purposes of resolving an internal conflict and preventing conflicts between groups in that country and separating them. So that's completely different from what's being proposed by opening government. The opening government is proposing something along the lines of NATO, with a unified ASEAN military that is going to stand up to China, right? So this is an interesting interpretation of this motion. We don't think it's what this motion called for. But if that's what they want to talk about in this debate, opening opposition will agree to it and debate it. So, a few things I want to discuss. The first thing I want to discuss is this sort of mythical interpretation of China's foreign relations. Exactly what China's foreign policy looks like, and the real implications this will have for security and stability in the region. Next, I'm going to talk about the importance of the United Nations. about how resolution of conflict needs to go through the UN, and how operating within that framework is much more effective within the context of international law than the sort of unilateral military that they're creating. And finally, I want to talk about the importance of ASEAN as an economic organization, and point out that there's fundamental differences in security and the position on security among ASEAN members. So at the point that you conflate economics and security, you decrease the likelihood of the organization being functional in any capacity, which has enormous harms for stability in the region. So first, let's talk about China. The conception they give us here is that China is being a bully in the South China Sea, and if ASEAN merely unified into a mutual defense organization and fielded a navy, China would back down. What we recognize on the opposition is that isn't how Chinese foreign policy works. And we can see this in the example of the dispute over the Senkaku Islands with Japan, right? Japan has a vastly larger military budget than all of the ASEAN member states put together. It has explicit support from the United States in the form of a mutual defense pact. And even in spite of this, China has not been willing to budge an inch on foreign policy. They've not been willing to negotiate. They haven't backed down against a set of opponents who are dramatically more powerful than ASEAN, right? And this is because of the internal dynamics of Chinese politics. The Chinese government panders to nationalist interests because doing so is critical to sustaining their domestic political capital. Yes?
Then it costs a lot more capital, political capital for China to intervene in the South China Sea when it sees that there are other warships there ready to fight.
Thank you. Sir, you are absolutely wrong. And this is what I'm going to discuss. The message this sends to the Chinese public, if ASEAN creates a unified military and China then backs down, is that China was beaten. That the government was unable to enforce Chinese territorial claims. And that isn't a position the Chinese government can take. So what's really going to happen here is a never-escalating series of provocations until there is violence. And the fact of the matter, since China can't back down, ASEAN members are not willing to fight a war with China. A war they won't win, a war that would have devastating economic consequences. So there's only one outcome here, and that is that blood is spilled, and ASEAN has to back down. So in the long run, there is no solvency here. You weaken the organization, and you destroyed international relations and destabilized trade lanes to no benefit. So that's the first issue. There's no solvency, there's only harm on the side of the opening government. But next, let's talk a little bit about the UN Charter, right? The current framework for resolving conflicts is the UN Security Council. And what we recognize on opening opposition is that, generally speaking, action within the UN is a good thing. In every case, the groups have created unilateral organizations to conduct military action outside of the framework of the United Nations. It's been harmful to international peace. Look at NATO's unilateral action in Iraq, and the Arab League's attempts at unilateral action in South Sudan, even the African Union's attempt at unilateral action in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In all of these cases, acting outside the UN Charter has both delegitimized the organization and been less effective than working within the framework of the UN, which can coordinate peacekeeping actions. So that's the mechanism that ASEAN should use. At the point that China engages in territorial violations, or at the point that peacekeeping is needed in other member states, it should be done through the UN peacekeeping, which is legal under the UN Charter, which all of these countries are a signatory to, and which can collaborate resources much more effectively from all UN member states, right? So that's something that's gone entirely unaddressed. The legality of this action and its illegality within the framework of the United Nations. But finally, let's talk about the importance of economics. Because fundamentally, we think that ASEAN does a great deal of good in the region. That economic cooperation and free trade pacts among member states do a great deal to improve welfare for people. And this is an important benefit that would be destroyed in the world of the proposition. Why? Because ASEAN is already contentious. There are countries that have fundamentally opposite foreign policies, right? Singapore and Malaysia, Vietnam and the Philippines both have competing territorial claims in the South China Sea. So at the point that these countries fundamentally disagree on matters of security, taking an economic organization and forcing it together into a security organization destroys the willingness of these countries to cooperate. At the point that the Philippines believes that Vietnam is being supported to a greater degree than itself, or vice versa, you see these countries withdrawing. At the point that Singapore believes it's making a greater contribution to security forces than Malaysia, Singapore will no longer be willing to shoulder that burden, right? So at this point, you destroy the legitimacy of ASEAN, which has powerful benefits in terms of economics, because these countries are no longer willing to participate in an organization which is fundamentally hostile to their national security interests. This isn't a hypothetical. We can see this as what had happened exactly in the League of Arab States. The League of Arab States was originally a regional body that aimed at producing economic cooperation and cultural cooperation among member states. And when the League of Arab States morphed into an organization that became engaged in issues like Syria or Egypt or Sudan, countries began to withdraw. Regional power blocs developed within the League of Arab States, and the organization's mission was undermined not just in terms of effective peacekeeping, but in terms of its ability to promote economic cooperation among the member countries, causing an enormous deterioration of benefits for its members. So what have we demonstrated to in this speech? Their concept of China is wrong. China won't back down, they can't back down, and bloodshed is the only reasonable outcome of this policy. The UN Charter is the only legal framework to develop peacekeeping forces, and unilateral action is fundamentally harmful in every case outside of the UN framework. And finally, because ASEAN is so critically important for economic stability, and because the fundamentally competing interests of ASEAN member states would force them to withdraw from the organization, there are no benefits and only harms associated with this model, and we urge you to oppose.
I'd like to thank you, especially already came up inside. I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to take place.
International arbitration doesn't work if China doesn't agree to it. Consistently, historically, this has been what is happening. There's this thing called the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea, or the UNCLOS for short, for when we refer to this later on in the debate. This basically makes sure, if you read the law and see how it applies to the Spratly Islands, for example, that China doesn't actually have a claim over that, and that the 5-dash line has no legal basis. Things like this, when China knows it will lose when it takes things to the level of international arbitration, are why we know that when China doesn't want things to go there, they can stop that from happening. Why is that so? That is so because China is a part of the P5, which is a part of the UN Security Council, which never leaves there, and it has veto power. Its clout within the UN is actually quite powerful, and acting independently of the UN ideologically is one of the most important things in relation to China that the nations within the ASEAN can do. But that's not all we want to talk about, right? Because we do recognize that this peacekeeping force will have a lot of domestic applications. What I'm going to talk about in constructive is about the regional conflicts and how they sometimes transcend borders within these regions. I'm going to talk about the jurisdictional problems and how this cuts across that and makes it so that you're able to address conflicts more efficiently, along with a lot of other benefits such as mutual support, pooled resources, and coordination. But before I get to that, a few more responses, right? Because what they're talking about is the preference for international arbitration. That's what I decided to talk about in my introduction, because that seemed to be the largest part of their case. And I've already shown that China has the ability to throw its weight around in the international arena. Remember, even the other biggest players on the international stage are things like the United States of America, to which they owe China $1 trillion. That's why we think the UNSC in general will create problems if you're oriented in this manner. But beyond that sit down, we think that we don't really destroy the economic benefits of ASEAN because we don't think they're going to stop participating, right? The ASEAN, on issues that will be disputed between countries inside of it, will not be taking sides, especially when it comes to security issues. They will only act when everything is agreed to by concerned parties when it comes to intervening with certain conflicts. So when the Philippines starts reclaiming Sabah, for example, from Malaysia based on some historical documents that I won't bother explaining, it will not be the ASEAN's place to take sides on maybe it should go to the Philippines, maybe it should go to Malaysia. This policy will not be changing that sit down. what didn't we get a response to, right? First of all, the principle that Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia all have claims over the Spratly Islands. Even if they're competing against each other, historically, in the past few years, they've already agreed to cooperate in working against China. This is a logical next step along that line. And it will protect the individual interests of these nations at each instance of these nations' claims, because they're making sure that China can't be getting that. But more practically, China does have veto power, and China will back down if it risks political capital, or else it will lose room to move in other conflicts, such as Tibet, the Senkaku Islands, and many of the other international things it is involved in. Before I start constructing, yes.
So if China isn't willing to back down in the Senkaku Islands against opponents who have vastly more resources, why would they be willing to back down here?
Because you have more resources than you had in the past. We're not saying we're going to get China to fold at every instance, Mr. Speaker, but the fact that we're comparatively better off than before is an undeniable benefit. And we think when you measure things in terms of political clout, and when you do start measuring things on a spectrum in terms of how negotiations will go and the power politics that will be involved there, you will get more and more concessions slowly, or at worst, you will be staving it off more effectively. But let's go to my constructive. Let's start talking about regional conflicts. First of all, one of the biggest problems that you can imagine is that these conflicts will often transcend borders. And the problem that arises in that situation is the question, who has jurisdiction? Let me take you through an example. Several months ago, armed Filipinos from the southern region of our country occupied a part of Sabah, which is in northeastern Malaysia, claiming it for the Philippines. Again, this is complicated historical claim involved here that I won't really explain. But the problem that arose in that situation was that Malaysia couldn't just shoot these people, even if what they were doing was completely illegal in the way that they were trying to actualize their claim. Because to do so would have risked inflaming cross-border tensions and would have risked, at worst, possibly a war between Malaysia and the Philippines. But we don't even think that that unlikely scenario is the only thing to be afraid of. Raised tensions will always be bad, right? Our policy cuts across that problem, because now Malaysia can invite in a more neutral body to intervene in that situation without risking pissing the Philippines off too much, because the Philippines recognizes that yes, these aren't our people, and it's easier to justify to the voting public in the Philippines that the ASEAN intervene for the sake of peacekeeping in that region rather than Malaysia kill some of our people, right? We think the impetus for this is actually quite strong, because you do still have the Jemaah Islamiyah, for example, operating across Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. There are a lot of transnational, violent, non-state actors that are going to be posing a threat, and more than just handling the jurisdiction problem, we're going to be shoring up mutual support. We're going to be increasing the quality of the cooperation between different countries, and we're going to be pooling resources more as well. That last thing I'd like to talk about now in terms of having benefits in other than just transnational conflicts. Because you do have certain, all over Southeast Asia, Mr. Speaker, you have weak states. Weak states that are unable to really in themselves handle certain domestic conflicts that they're going to be dealing with, and will do so more slowly without the outside help of an ASEAN peacekeeping force. It's going to be easier, especially now that we're taking down a lot of the a lot of the implications of our borders come 2015. Now that I won't need a visa to go to anywhere else in Southeast Asia. Now that that's happening, the interdependence is going to give in with us as well to make it so that all of the involved countries will have more of a reason to help other countries out in resolving conflicts that are purely domestic. We believe this is definitely a good thing. So in light of that and everything Daryl said, we are very glad to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his speech. Now I invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close opening debate.
Is everyone ready? Mr. Speaker, for every problem there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. And creating a military commitment amongst members may sound like a very neat solution. Unfortunately, it's wrong because it overlooks the reality of the situation. China empirically does not back down in response to military aggression. In fact, they are making a simulation of a war against Japan in response to the Senkaku Islands and the build-up to Japan, which means the idea of weak states cooperating will actually fall flat on its face. Now, my partner talked to you about the idea of China escalation occurring, right? He talked to you about the idea of why economic cooperation serves as a better avenue for cooperation amongst these states as opposed to military commitments. He talked to you about the UN legality of this, right? I'm going to expand on this argument, the idea that the United Nations serves as the best point for engagement in response to regional tensions. In fact, I'll explain this with respect to two arguments. First is that working outside the United Nations reduces cooperation amongst across the globe, and second is that it results in increased aggression and escalates conflicts. But before I get to these two main points, I'll address the falsities presented to you by the previous speaker. Now, the first argument that Nick presents to you is that the idea that China has no claim over this battle is according to UNCLOS, right? Well, China doesn't recognize international arbitration, but the best way to ensure that it does in the future is to have it included within the United Nations, right? We think that the best way for countries to be engaged with binding international commitments is if they recognize the legitimacy of that kind of body. If you create a regional body that challenges it, it will not see the United Nations as being a legitimate form, which means that they will not recognize that international arbitration in the future. The next argument that Nick presents to you is this idea that only with agreement does action occur. Yes, we agree that agreement is good, right? We think that multiple countries working across the globe agreeing to something is in fact a better, more legitimate form of addressing problems. We think that that agreement that they decry is actually far more important. Moreover, if it's true that there's problems with agreements, this is a downfall for their argument as well, because there will be regional disputes, will be a lack of agreement, and that will reduce the efficacy of an ASEAN military agreement. Now, the next argument they present is this idea of all the competing claims being reduced because they'll be standing against China. Well, one, it still leads to infighting, even if they have another even if they have a larger threat, because that larger threat already exists, but they still have infighting occurring right now, right? We think that they just make the problem worse. But second is that it would lead to escalation with China, because China would not back down, and the ASEAN countries would have to back down because of economic reasons. The next argument they present is the idea of regional conflicts. Well, we think that regional conflicts are better solved by the United Nations, right? Nick brings to the idea of a moral neutral body being important, right? The most neutral body is the United Nations because they're united across the entire globe. Having a regional body would in fact increase escalation with China because China would not see that body as neutral. They would see it as trying to defend the interests of other countries and see it as hostile. We think that China would not back down, would just increase aggression. And finally, they bring the idea that weak states need to band together. The weak states would not be stronger than Japan and United States combined, right? We think that if China's already making a simulated war against Japan, if they're already preparing for that, then the idea of deterrence just empirically fails. Now my main 2 points of extension. One, that and before I do that, I'll address Daryl's point.
So, you're okay with the South China Sea where China has patrol boats and gunboats and the ASEAN fishermen and the shipping lines don't have any protection?
Yeah, see, we don't agree with the idea of the naval arms race being the correct way to solve it, right? We think having more warships there wouldn't actually solve the problem. We think it would make it worse. I think that it's pretty well agreed that if everybody in the room has some guns, it's going to create a lot more tensions and wouldn't really solve anything. But now the main idea of reducing cooperation, right? Now the United Nations was established to serve as a forum for countries to cooperate with one another. But when you delegitimize that kind of avenue, it means that countries don't have an incentive to work with each other. The United States and Russia disagreed with the way that we should engage with Syria, right? There was a lot of tension. There was problems with disagreeing. The United States wanted to intervene militarily to have a peacekeeping operation, right? But Russia did not back down in this, and the diplomatic solution was such that there was no escalation of tension. Instead, it paved the way for increased cooperation between the United States and Russia, whereas if the United States had engaged in its peacekeeping operations with NATO, it would have reduced the ability for the United States and Russia to cooperate on important issues such as disease and such as regional conflicts. But more importantly is this idea of increasing escalation. We think that if you work outside of the United Nations, you create the conditions for which countries want to increase their aggression, right? We think you can see this in the context of NATO. My partner brought to you the idea of NATO and the United States working together to intervene in Iraq, and that was based on a farce, right? We think that that kind of aggression only takes place when regional bodies feel they can work outside of the United Nations. We think that in the context of the South China Sea, aggression would take place. The problem is it wouldn't play out to the advantage of ASEAN. My partner Braden told you how China does not back down because of the internal political climate. It needs to rely on nationalism to quell the population, right? We think that if this is the case, the only one who would back down would be the weak states who can't outweigh China's military force. And when that happens, you have a now reduced, you have a climate that is not conducive to cooperation, a climate in which ASEAN's legitimacy has been eroded, and the very benefits that they claim have been destroyed. So in an increasingly globalized world, we think it's far more important for you to focus on global institutions, right? We think focusing on regional bodies such as NATO makes the world a far more unstable place. They bring to you the idea of China encroaching on sovereignty against other nations. This would be made 10 times worse if you were to have an escalation in response, right? We can see this happening now. The best way to address this would be diplomatically, because it would reduce the idea of aggression and increase the emphasis on cooperation. We think that this is far better solution. And what's more, we think that in context of South China Sea, escalating the conflicts would not be good for the fishermen, right? We think that China responding militarily would not be good, right? We think that it's far better instead to focus on diplomatic solutions at the global level as opposed to a regional level where tensions will be even more present because of reduced legitimacy. So what has opening opposition showed you today? We've showed you that on multiple fronts, the only scenario is conflict escalation, and the resulting effects would be reduced cooperation. We think that working outside of the United Nations is in fact a wrong way to approach solving regional issues. We think that the best way to reduce aggression, we think that the best way to increase cooperation would be to not focus on regional bodies, but instead to focus on global bodies that have more legitimacy and have less of a claim to violence. And for those reasons, we strongly urge you to oppose the model. Thank you very much.
Can I use the bathroom now? Come on.
Go. You're coming in the trash. Go.
Thank you.
Go. You need to go.
Who else want to go?
Go now, rest in peace.
I'll go.
Go now, rest in peace.
All the men go.